just for a moment, that there were no trade wars, no Brexit, and no climate change. Imagine that there were not an average of 114 rapes reported per day by South African crime statistics. Imagine that that was not me as a result of domestic violence at the hands of my abusive alcoholic ex-husband. Imagine that I and millions of other women around the world did not fear for the safety of our own children in our own home. I could be the person that stands up here and says, men are trash. And I choose not to. And I choose not to. Why? Because of my son, my kind, loving, wonderful son, and all the young boys and men that have been unfairly put under this name. It's harmful. And what it does is it shuts down the people that we need to work together, that we need to form a connection with. So my second husband and I started a company called Hers and His. And Hers first. Hers and His is focused on a passion of building gender equality. And what I'm about to propose and talk about today is that we truly believe that we can change the rules. In fact, we can and we must change the rules. And in those rules, what it means is that something that was relevant in the past doesn't necessarily mean that those rules are relevant now or in the future. So we have never seen more focus on gender equality than there is now. We've seen marches, we've seen silent vigils, we've seen diversity and inclusion programs or D&I programs, focus groups and dialogue sessions and all of that. And in amongst all of that activity that is happening, the World Economic Global Gender Gap Report predicted that United States women won't gain equality with men for another 208 years. 208 years! Which is why Melinda Gates launched Equality Can't Wait. And this is not just a hashtag. This is a program that is based on research, on strategy, on focus and discipline in terms of what's going to be happening. It's based on data. And her data tells us that empowered women transform societies. Which is why the focus of gender equality is that we're seeing businesses across the globe focus on things like changing their policies and procedures, looking at pay gaps, gender pay gaps, understanding what it means in terms of selection bias. And with all of this, it's still not enough to change the paradigm that we have right now. The reason why, it's because of us on a granular level. Us human beings don't know how to participate in this global conversation. And that's a problem, right? It's a global conversation. So besides the companies that are doing diversity and inclusion in terms of a tick box on their spreadsheets, what are you and I doing? How do we, participate in this conversation around gender equality? What do we do in our own lives to contribute and move us to where we need to be? It's all about changing the rules, and not necessarily only the written ones. It's the unwritten rules that need to be changed. And how do we do that? By asking one single question of ourselves. How can I make the world a more inclusive place? And to answer that question, there is no shortage of information out there. There is research, articles, theories, opinions, lots of opinions of what we should be doing. And I see gender equality in the strangest of places. Looking through a woman's magazine, and it's like, okay, makeup for the mature woman, how to grow a veggie garden, gender equality is the next focus in the agricultural industry. That's wonderful. How? There's something missing from all the noise that we're seeing out there. And what we believe is that it's about the skills. What are the skills that you and I need, that everybody needs globally, to be able to change the shift on a global level towards moving towards gender equality? So the first thing you need to know about is unconscious bias. And unconscious bias is exactly that. It's unconscious, right? And it actually, so by way of an example of the bias, gendered bias, would be something like the belief that men are leaders and women are supporters. And really how it works and why it happens, it's something that happens in the way that our brain works. So our brain loves to sift, sort, and categorize things. There's so much information that's coming our way, and it likes to make shortcuts and associations. So these associations build beliefs and understandings that we hold as true, but they're unconscious. And it's based on our experiences, our learnings, and our socialization. And if you think you're immune to unconscious bias, the reality is not all of us participate in unconscious bias in some way or another. And it doesn't make us bad people. That's the way our brains work. But what is important here is to understand, when we understand unconscious bias, we can then purposefully make decisions to move towards understanding our stereotypes, moving away from discrimination and moving away from prejudice. So what do we do with this information now we know about unconscious bias? Well, the next thing is to be curious. And when we are curious, we are open-hearted and open-minded. When we are curious, we listen to hear. We don't listen for the next retort. When we are curious, we listen to understand. And in that understanding, we then can create connection. We can cultivate connection by being curious and trying to understand what the other person is saying. So, I've given you two concepts, and now I need to give you some actions. And change the language isn't as great as it sounds. All I'm suggesting is that we change two words in our language that relates directly to the concepts around that too. But first, before I say that, the invitation is to just shift a little bit of a mindset before I give you the words. That mindset is around binary. In the world is not binary, right? Gender is not binary. There's white and black. There's not white and black, actually. There's gray in the middle. There's not yes and no. There's a maybe in the middle of that. And so with our curiosity hat on now, just understand what it would be like to change the word correction to connection. Can you imagine the conversations in your dining room when you didn't have something like that's wrong or that's good and that's bad? So by way of an example of the power of moving correction to connection, I was married to an abusive alcoholic, and I was stuck in the focus of crisis, chaos, and conflict. And my mindset was around correction. I'm right, you're wrong. And I stuck in that pattern for a very long time. It was only when I moved to correction, connection. It was only when I moved to connection that first of all, connection to myself, and second of all, connection to my ex-husband, that we could actually move away from the toxic situation. It was only when in this connection, in a sober moment, he could hear me and understand what I was saying about how difficult it was, that we could find a new, healthier path in terms of the way that we were. And this path is about connection. Connection, actually, is one of the most powerful things that mankind can own. The next word to change is but to and. And when we include intentionally, then there is a shift that happens where we start feeling and we start taking responsibility. Instead of making it the government's responsibility or businesses' responsibility, they must get to the 50-50 ratios that everyone says we must have. This is about an attitude. And the attitude is around, I hear you, and, rather than, yeah, but, because we know anything that is said before the but, right, it doesn't count. So an example of the power of but being changed to and in an attitude would be something that goes like this. We need to include Lebel, but she's too young and inexperienced, versus an attitude of, we need to include Lebel, and she is young and inexperienced, and she can learn and grow. So the next skill is active listening. And active listening is not a leadership skill, it's an everybody skill. And in this everybody skill, it's not about listening with our ears, it's about listening with our heart, with our eyes, and with our mind in terms of active listening. And when we are curious, it actually is much easier to have active listening. And in that active listening, there's a little bit of magic that happens. And that magic is a change in understanding that our differences are gifts instead of threats. So let me say that again. When we practice curiosity and active listening, we start interpreting differences as a gift rather than a threat. So my favorite story from hers and his co-gender at work workshops is a story about a warehouse manager who in our workshop realized that he was practicing selection bias by not even considering female forklift drivers. And so he knew that he needed to change the rules, but he didn't know how. And we said one simple thing to him: be curious, ask questions. 5 months later, there are 3 forklift drivers in that warehouse. The last thing the action for us is to be players and not victims. Players do something that matters. Victims moan and most often don't achieve anything. And I have to tell you, very important, if you think that you're doing something and you're a player by being on social media, it doesn't count. Putting a tick, doing a heart, having an online conversation about gender equality doesn't change anybody's perspective and doesn't change our world either. It is time for us to take action. And it doesn't matter what it is, but each and every one of us can take and do a little something to move our worlds closer to where we want them to be. Do something that's within your budget and within your time frame, but do something. And it doesn't matter what it is. Volunteer for women's empowerment work. Do Fathering a Nation. Even just healing our own wounds helps us. And women, in being players instead of victims, the invitation is to find your forgiving heart. It's hard. I know. I could be one that says, I don't want to do that. But, and, see what I did there? And when we stay in anger, hatred, and fear, then it's not first of all helping you, but it's not helping the world in general in terms of being able to find the connection and create men as allies. And men as allies is the one thing that is really needed in building gender equality. So men, your role in being players, not victims, is to put aside your defensiveness. Be curious, ask questions, and please change the rules because you can. Not because you need a diversity tick box, but because you want to, for yourself and for society. So So the call to action is choose connection every time. And how do we do that? By remaining curious, by moving correction to connection, by moving but to and, by having active listening, taking action, women moving forward and stepping towards with a forgiving heart instead of stepping back, and for men to set aside your defensiveness and change the rules. So imagine that the word rape was not used because it seldom happened. Imagine that a woman didn't have to feel the crunch of a fist in her face. Imagine that women are revered and respected as equals in a society that sees and values difference and diversity. Thank you.